It was the summer of 2008 in Cedar Hill, a quiet suburban town nestled in the heart of Missouri. Like any typical Friday afternoon, the air was thick with heat, kids were out playing, and parents were gearing up for the weekend. But for two best friends, 12-year-olds Emily Carter and Sarah Thompson, that day would forever mark the end of their innocence and the beginning of a nightmare. The girls had been inseparable since kindergarten. That Friday they decided to walk to the local convenience store to grab snacks and sodas before heading to the nearby park. They left their bikes locked near the store and walked the few blocks back. Then they vanished. Emily's mother, Carol, first noticed something was wrong when Emily didn't return home by dinner time. She tried Sarah's parents, but they hadn't heard from their daughter either. Panic set in quickly, and the police were called by 7 p.m. By nightfall, search parties were formed, and the entire town seemed to turn out, scouring the streets and nearby woods. Posters with the girls' smiling faces plastered every lamppost and bulletin board in Cedar Hill, but there was no trace of them. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. As hope for the girls' safe return dwindled, a dark shadow loomed over the town. Rumors circulated, and suspicions grew, but no real leads ever emerged. Cedar Hill began to move on slowly and painfully, but not everyone could let go. Carol Carter never stopped believing her daughter was alive, but she had no idea how close she was to the truth. 3 miles from Cedar Hill's town center, on the edge of a dense forest, stood an old, decrepit house nearly hidden from the road by overgrown brush. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging in parts, and the driveway covered in weeds. It was a place most people avoided, assuming it was abandoned. But to Emily and Sarah, this house had been their prison for 12 long years. Their captor was a man named Gregor Shaw, a seemingly harmless handyman who had lived in Cedar Hill for as long as anyone could remember. He blended in with the locals, keeping to himself and never raising suspicion. But behind his mild-mannered appearance, he was a meticulous predator. On that fateful summer day in 2008, he had been lurking, waiting for the perfect moment. He saw the girls walking alone, and the opportunity was too good to pass up. In an instant, he pulled up beside them in his faded white van, pretending to ask for directions. Emily and Sarah, always polite, approached the window. That was when Shaw grabbed them, using chloroform to knock them out before dragging their limp bodies into the back of the van. They awoke hours later, disoriented and terrified, in the dark, damp basement of his house. Their wrists were bound, and a chain around their ankles connected them to a bolt in the floor. The basement was small and cold, with a single, dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Mold crept along the stone walls, and the smell of decay filled the air. There were no windows, no way to tell what time of day it was, or how long they had been there. Shaw was methodical, controlling every aspect of their lives. He brought them food once a day, just enough to keep them alive, and sometimes went weeks without speaking a word to them. His presence alone was terrifying enough. The girls learned quickly that Shaw wasn't interested in the ransom or attention their disappearance had garnered. His motives were far more sinister. He wanted control. Over the years, he broke their spirits, using manipulation and fear to ensure they never attempted escape. Every time they heard the basement door creak open, their hearts raced with dread. Shaw wasn't just a captor, he was a monster who thrived on their suffering. But even after 12 years in captivity, hope flickered within the girls. They hadn't forgotten who they were, and deep inside, the fight for survival never left them. All they needed was one chance. 12 years in that basement warped time. Emily and Sarah lost track of the days, weeks, and seasons. What began as cries for help, pounding on the walls, and desperate attempts to pry the chains from the floor had gradually faded into silence. The girls, now women, had grown accustomed to their meager existence, though the weight of despair was always present. The room they once fought against became their world. Gregor Shaw rarely spoke to them, but his presence was always felt. He controlled their lives, from what they ate to when they were allowed to shower, which was usually just a bucket of cold water dumped on them in the corner of the basement. The room had a mattress so thin it barely offered comfort, and a small bucket for a toilet that he occasionally emptied when he remembered. Despite everything, the two girls formed an unbreakable bond in their shared nightmare. When one broke down, the other found strength to hold on, reminding her they could survive. Together, they navigated the brutal reality of their captivity. Shaw had taken everything from them, their childhoods, their innocence, their families. Yet in his twisted way, he thought of them as his possessions, like dolls kept in a box, only brought out when he felt like it. His attempts to break them mentally and emotionally were relentless. He would taunt them, dangle keys to their chains just out of reach, then laugh coldly when their hope faltered. Over time, he instilled in them a sense of helplessness, convincing them escape was impossible, and no one was coming for them. But Emily never completely gave up. In the long stretches of time when Shaw left them alone, she and Sarah would whisper plans. They knew every inch of that basement, every crack in the concrete, and every loose stone. While Sarah focused on keeping her mind sharp, recalling details about their childhood and their families, Emily kept her eyes on the door, memorizing how Shaw moved, how long he stayed upstairs, and what routines he might have that could offer a chance at escape. 12 years of captivity had not erased who they were, but the strain was undeniable. So Millie and Sarah were no longer the carefree girls they once had been. They were survivors, their will to live driven by a fire that even Shaw's cruelty couldn't extinguish. On the surface, Gregor Shaw lived an ordinary life. He worked odd jobs around Cedar Hill, fixing gutters, mowing lawns, and doing minor repairs for those who needed it. Neighbors waved at him, thinking he was just a quiet, solitary man who kept to himself. No one suspected the horrors hidden beneath his dilapidated house on the edge of town. But as the years passed, Shaw began to grow careless. His need for control wasn't satisfied anymore. The two girls locked in his basement weren't enough, and his desire for more was becoming dangerous. In 2020, a real estate company started showing interest in buying up the land near Shaw's house for development. The idea of strangers sniffing around his property made Shaw nervous. He didn't like visitors, especially uninvited ones. One day, a local realtor, Michael Granger, knocked on Shaw's door, hoping to convince him to sell the land. Shaw, as always, was wary of anyone coming too close. But Michael was persistent. He mentioned that a construction crew would be doing surveys in the area soon, and Shaw's land was one of the properties they were targeting. This set off alarm bells for Shaw, but he maintained his calm demeanor. He couldn't afford to attract attention, especially with what he kept hidden below. Down in the basement, Emily and Sarah heard the faint sounds of conversation. It had been years since they'd heard anyone outside of Shaw. They pressed their ears to the cold floor, trying to pick up anything they could. Could this man be their savior? Was this the opportunity they had been waiting for? But Shaw was careful. He knew how to play his cards right, brushing off Michael's insistence with false promises to consider the offer. As the realtor left, Shaw stood at the door for a long time, watching until the man's car disappeared down the road. Something had shifted. The idea of someone finding out his secret was becoming too real. Later that night, when Shaw descended into the basement, there was a different air about him. He didn't bring food or water as he usually did. Instead, he stood in the doorway, his dark silhouette looming over Emily and Sarah, who were huddled together in the corner. "There are people coming," he said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "If they find you, it'll be over for all of us." The girls exchanged a terrified glance. Shaw had never spoken like this before. Was he planning something? The tension was unbearable, and they couldn't read his next move. "I'm thinking I might have to make some changes," Shaw added cryptically before turning and walking out, leaving the basement door open just a crack. Emily's heart raced. This was the first time the door had ever been left ajar. This was it. This could be their chance to escape. But was it a trap? The basement door hung slightly open, and for the first time in 12 years, Emily and Sarah saw a sliver of hope, literally. The faint beam of light from the hallway above sliced through the darkness like a lifeline. Shaw's parting words echoed in their minds. Was he testing them? Or had he grown so arrogant after so many years that he thought escape was impossible? Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she crawled toward the door, her ankle chain clinking softly against the concrete floor. Sarah reached out and grabbed her arm. "Emily, don't," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "What if he's just waiting for us to try something?" Emily knew the risk, but something in Shaw's demeanor had changed. Maybe he was getting sloppy, or maybe the stress of outside pressure was making him lose control. Either way, Emily wasn't willing to let this moment slip by without trying. "If we don't take this chance, we might not get another," she whispered back, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Sarah bit her lip, her mind racing. She wanted to believe that escape was possible, but after 12 years of failed attempts, it was hard to hope. Still, Emily was right. They couldn't spend the rest of their lives in that basement. If Shaw was starting to crack, their window for escape might be closing as quickly as it had opened. Emily moved slowly, carefully lifting herself up to peek through the crack in the door. The hallway beyond was empty. Shaw had left a light on upstairs, and she could hear faint noises coming from above the sound of the television. Shaw's heavy footsteps pacing the floorboards. Her mind worked furiously, trying to piece together a plan. If they could just make it out of the basement, they'd have a fighting chance. "Help me with the chain," Emily whispered urgently. Sarah nodded and crawled over to her, examining the bolt that held them both to the floor. Over the years, they'd tried everything to loosen it: rocks, broken pieces of wood, even their bare hands, but it had always been too strong. Emily's fingers were scarred from past attempts, but she ignored the pain as she pulled at the metal once again. Then, something happened that neither of them expected. The bolt shifted, ever so slightly. Emily gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Did you feel that?" she whispered, hope flickering in her voice. Sarah, too, grabbed hold of the bolt and pulled with all her strength. Another tiny movement. "It's loose," Emily said, her voice barely a breath. They had weakened it over the years without even realizing it. The girls exchanged a look, a mixture of fear and determination. This was their moment. Emily pulled harder, using every ounce of strength she had left. The metal groaned in protest, but it was moving. Sarah joined in, her hands shaking from the effort. Finally, with one last wrenching pull, the bolt gave way, and the chain slipped free. They were still shackled, but at least they were no longer tethered to the floor. Emily grabbed Sarah's hand, and they stood, their legs weak and unsteady from years of confinement. The hallway stretched before them like a dangerous unknown, but they had no choice now. Emily peeked out again, ensuring Shaw wasn't nearby, then slowly opened the door wider. It creaked slightly, sending a jolt of terror through them both. They froze, listening for any sign that Shaw had heard, but the sounds of the TV continued, oblivious to their movements. They slipped out of the basement, their hearts in their throats. Each step was agonizingly slow as they made their way up the narrow staircase. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, every creak threatening to expose them. Finally, they reached the top, the dim light from the living room casting eerie shadows along the walls. Shaw was in his recliner, his back to them, the television flickering with muted images. He hadn't noticed them yet. Emily's breath hitched as she spotted the front door, just across the room. Freedom was so close. She could practically feel the cool night air on her skin. She glanced at Sarah, who nodded in silent agreement. They had to move now. But just as they took their first step into the living room, Shaw shifted in his chair. His head turned slightly, and for a terrifying moment, Emily thought he had seen them. She and Sarah ducked behind the kitchen counter, barely out of sight. Shaw stood up. Their hearts stopped. Gregor Shaw stretched, his joints cracking as he stood up from the recliner. The television cast flickering light across his haggard face as he shuffled toward the kitchen, oblivious to the two girls crouching just out of sight. Emily pressed her back against the cabinet, her body trembling. Sarah squeezed her hand, her nails digging into Emily's palm. They had to stay silent. Any noise would be their death sentence. Shaw stopped just a few feet from where they hid. Emily could hear his heavy breathing, and she imagined his cold, emotionless eyes scanning the room, perhaps sensing something was amiss. The girls held their breath as he opened the fridge, the low hum of the motor filling the silence. He grabbed a beer and slammed the door shut, pausing for a moment before heading back to his chair. Sarah let out a quiet breath, her whole body sagging with relief. They were alive barely. But their window of escape was closing. Shaw would be back in his recliner soon, and then slipping past him would be nearly impossible. They had to act now, while his back was still turned. Emily nodded to Sarah. It was time. They crept toward the front door, moving as silently as they could. Every inch forward felt like a lifetime. Just as Emily reached for the doorknob, her shackled ankle brushed against a metal coat rack standing by the door. The sound of it tipping over was like a bomb going off in the quiet room. Shaw spun around instantly, his eyes locking on them. The metallic clang of the coat rack hitting the floor was deafening. For a moment, time stood still as Gregor Shaw's cold, furious eyes locked onto the girls. His face twisted into a mask of rage as he realized what was happening. Emily's heart pounded in her ears, her hand frozen on the doorknob. "You little," Shaw's words erupted in a guttural snarl as he lunged toward them. Panic surged through Emily and Sarah's bodies, electrifying their limbs into action. Emily twisted the doorknob frantically, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. She fumbled with the lock, her fingers shaking so violently she could barely grip the latch. Sarah, seeing Shaw closing the distance fast, screamed, "Hurry, Emily!" Shaw's heavy footsteps pounded behind them as Emily finally yanked the door open. The cool night air rushed in, and for the first time in 12 years, they could see the outside world dark, open, and terrifyingly free. But Shaw was right there. He grabbed Sarah by her hair and yanked her backward with such force that she cried out in pain. Her legs kicked wildly as she struggled to escape his grip. "Sarah!" Emily screamed, turning back to help her friend. Shaw's strength was terrifying, fueled by years of sadistic control over the girls. He dragged Sarah to the floor, his hand clamped around her throat, squeezing as he pinned her to the ground. Emily's mind raced. She had to do something, anything, before Shaw killed Sarah in front of her. Without thinking, Emily grabbed the nearest object she could find, a rusty fire poker from the hearth beside the door. With a scream, she swung it at Shaw with all the force she could muster. The metal cracked against his shoulder, sending him reeling back. Shaw roared in pain and surprise, momentarily letting go of Sarah as he stumbled to the side. "Run, Sarah!" Emily shouted. Gasping for breath, Sarah scrambled to her feet and bolted out the open door. Emily was right behind her, but Shaw recovered quickly. Fueled by rage, he lunged again, catching Emily by her arm just as she crossed the threshold. His fingers dug into her flesh, pulling her back into the house. "No!" Emily screamed, kicking and thrashing. She could see Sarah just a few feet ahead, turning back toward her. "Go!" Emily cried. "Run and get help." Sarah hesitated, her tear-streaked face torn between terror and guilt. But she knew Emily was right. If she didn't go now, neither of them would make it out alive. With one last, pained look at her friend, Sarah turned and sprinted into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Emily fought with every ounce of strength she had left, swinging the fire poker wildly as Shaw wrestled her back into the house. His grip tightened, his fury palpable. "You think you can get away from me?" he spat, shoving her against the wall. For a moment, Emily's vision blurred from the impact, her body aching from years of malnutrition and captivity. She could barely stand, but she had to keep fighting. She had to buy Sarah time. "Where's your friend now, huh?" Shaw sneered, his breath hot and rancid against her face. "You'll never make it out. She'll never make it out." But Emily didn't care what he said. She knew Sarah was gone, running for help. All she had to do was survive a little longer. Shaw slammed her to the ground, his foot pressing down on her chest, pinning her to the cold floor. The fire poker clattered from her hand, skidding across the floor out of reach. The house seemed to close in on her. Shaw's dark form loomed above, his face twisted with anger and a sick satisfaction. He had them back where he wanted, or so he thought. But something flickered in Emily's eyes, defiance. "You can't keep us forever," she spat through clenched teeth. Shaw's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. He bent down, gripping her by the neck, But before he could respond, a noise echoed from outside. Sirens. And far away at first, but unmistakable. The sound of salvation. Sarah had made it. Shaw's face shifted from rage to panic as the sound of police sirens grew louder, cutting through the night like a lifeline to Emily. He released his grip on her throat, backing away for a moment, his mind racing. In all the years he had held the girls captive, no one had come close to finding them. But now, the sound of help of freedom was closing in. Emily coughed, gasping for air, her body bruised and trembling from the struggle. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her. She wasn't strong enough to fight him anymore, but she didn't have to. The police were coming. She just had to survive a little longer. Shaw's eyes darted toward the open door, then back to Emily. He was trapped. The sirens were getting closer by the second, and soon his secret would be exposed. His carefully constructed world was crumbling. His jaw clenched, and for a terrifying moment, Emily thought he might kill her out of pure spite. But instead, Shaw made a desperate move. He turned and bolted toward the back of the house, disappearing into the dark hallway that led to the back door. He wasn't going to stick around to face the consequences. He was going to run. Emily struggled to her feet, her entire body shaking. She knew she couldn't let him escape. Not after everything he had done. She stumbled after him, her vision blurry and her head spinning. She reached the back door just as Shaw threw it open, disappearing into the night. Gregor Shaw burst into the dark woods behind the house, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he ran. The sirens were getting louder, closing in from every direction. He didn't have much time. For years he had controlled everything, their lives, their hope, but now it was all slipping through his fingers. His only chance was to vanish into the wilderness and disappear forever. But this wasn't how it was supposed to end. Inside the house, Emily staggered to the back door, her body protesting every movement. Her legs were weak, her vision blurry, but she pushed herself forward, driven by something deeper than pain or exhaustion, survival. She knew Shaw was on the run, and the thought of him slipping away into the night made her blood run cold. He couldn't escape. He couldn't be free to do this again. Stepping into the backyard, she scanned the woods, her eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The dense trees loomed like towering shadows, and the cool night air stung her skin. She heard the crack of a branch in the distance, the faint sound of Shaw moving deeper into the forest. Emily took a deep breath, swallowing her fear. She had no choice, she had to follow him. If she didn't, Shaw might disappear forever, and the nightmare would never end. Her feet moved without thinking, each step sending a jolt of pain through her weakened body. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She plunged into the woods, the underbrush tearing at her bare legs and arms. The sounds of Shaw crashing through the forest were erratic, like a wounded animal scrambling for its life. He was fast, but Emily was determined. The sirens were louder now, flashing lights casting a faint glow through the trees. Somewhere in the chaos, Sarah was with the police, leading them to the house, to safety. But Emily wasn't safe yet, not until Shaw was caught. Branches whipped her face, her lungs burned, but she kept running. She could hear Shaw ahead, panting heavily as he stumbled over roots and rock. He was close, and Emily's heart raced faster with each step. She spotted him, a dark figure moving through the trees, barely visible in the shadows. He was slowing down, and Emily knew this was her moment. With one final burst of energy, she launched herself toward him. Her hands clawed at his back, gripping the fabric of his shirt as she dragged him to the ground. Shaw grunted in surprise, struggling beneath her weight as they both tumbled into the dirt. "You're not getting away," Emily screamed, her voice hoarse but filled with fury. She had been waiting for this moment for 12 years. Shaw thrashed beneath her, his hands grabbing at the ground, trying to pull himself free, but Emily held on with everything she had left. Shaw swung his arm wildly, his elbow connecting with Emily's face. The impact sent her reeling, her vision flashing white as pain exploded through her skull. She cried out, momentarily stunned, but she refused to let go. She couldn't. If she let him go now, she might never get another chance. Shaw kicked at her, his boot connecting with her stomach, sending her sprawling back into the dirt. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily, his eyes wild with panic. He looked down at her, and for a moment there was a flicker of something dark in his gaze, a momentary reminder of the power he once held over her. But then the distant sound of police officers calling out pierced the air, and Shaw knew his time was up. Without another word, he turned and ran, disappearing deeper into the forest. Emily gasped for air, her body racked with pain, but she forced herself to her feet. She couldn't stop now. Not when Shaw was so close to getting away. Stumbling forward, she followed him, her legs trembling beneath her. She could hear him ahead, crashing through the trees, but he was slowing down. He was getting tired. Flashing lights of the police cars were visible through the trees now, casting an eerie blue and red glow across the forest. Emily pushed herself harder, fueled by the knowledge that help was near. And then suddenly Shaw was there, just a few yards ahead, caught between the approaching police and the dark forest beyond. He stopped, panting heavily, his eyes darting wildly. Emily could see the panic in his face, the realization that there was nowhere left to run. "Stop," a voice shouted from behind her. Emily turned to see several police officers running toward them, flashlights illuminating the trees. Hands in the air. Shaw's eyes flicked from Emily to the approaching officers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment it seemed like he might run again, but there was nowhere to go. The forest was closing in, and the sound of sirens drowned out any hope he had had of escape. Finally, with a look of utter defeat, Shaw raised his hands, his body sagging as the weight of the situation crashed down on him. The officers moved in quickly, surrounding him, guns drawn. Emily watched as they tackled him to the ground, his face pressed into the dirt as they cuffed his hands behind his back. It was over. Emily collapsed to her knees, her entire body shaking. Tears filled her eyes as the adrenaline finally wore off. She had done it. After 12 years of captivity, of fear, of suffering, she was free. Shaw was in custody. The nightmare was over. The days that followed were a blur for Emily and Sarah. The police swarmed Shaw's house, uncovering the horrors of the basement where the girls had been held for so many years. Reporters flooded Cedar Hill, turning the once quiet town into the epicenter of national news. The story of 2 girls, kidnapped and held in captivity for 12 years, shocked the nation. Emily and Sarah were taken to the hospital, where doctors marveled at their resilience. Malnourished, bruised, and emotionally scarred, they had survived against all odds. But the physical wounds were only part of their recovery. The trauma of 12 years in that basement would take much longer to heal. Carol Carter and the Thompson family rushed to the hospital the moment they heard the news. For Carol, seeing Emily alive, walking out of the nightmare, was the miracle she had never given up on. There were tears, embraces, and a flood of emotions that neither words nor time could fully express. Gregor Shaw was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, false imprisonment, and abuse. As the details of his crimes came to light, Cedar Hill could hardly believe that such evil had lived among them for so long, hidden behind the facade of a quiet, unassuming handyman. Emily and Sarah faced a long road ahead. They had been taken as children and returned as women, their entire adolescence stolen. But together they were determined to rebuild their lives. They had each other, and they had their freedom, something Shaw could never take from them again. It would take time, therapy, and countless difficult conversations, but they had survived, and that was a testament to their strength, their bond, and their unbreakable will to live. 12 years in a basement, but now they were free,